Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Very nice to see you. Welcome back to the 7th Darwin College lecture in the 2022 series, where we've been examining the interdisciplinary and fascinating theme of food. Earlier in the series, we have now explored the strong interdependencies between food and climate change, the challenges and opportunities of our pets, at least our cats and dogs, becoming vegan. We've looked at the interface between food and those who are in power, and we've looked at the vital role of X-rays in ensuring the safety of our food. We've also heard from a professional chef and restaurateur exploring food as expression. And last week, we had a very thought-provoking lecture examining the complex relationships between food, history, and culture, with a focus on early modern Italy. For this week, however, we go further back in time into the prehistoric ages and welcome Professor Martin Jones to present his lecture on the evolution of crop domestication in prehistory. Martin is the Emeritus George Pitt-Rivers Professor in Archaeological Science here at the University of Cambridge and a Senior Fellow in the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. He's taught and conducted research here in the Department of Archaeology at the university for over 30 years, and his research centres around bioarchaeology and early agriculture, including the spread of crops across the ancient world. In 2018, I'll say nothing more. Apologies. Martin was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in recognition of the remarkable work he has done in this field. He has, of course, been heavily involved in the leadership of Darwin College, having been elected as Fellow in 2002, and served for 12 years as the Vice Master from 2012 to 2018, my predecessor. He's also been a co-organiser of not one but two of the Darwin College lecture series, the one on blood last year, which was quite a challenge given the pandemic, but worked brilliantly thanks to Martin and his co-organiser, and a previous one in 2005 on conflict, which he co-organised with Professor Andrew Fabian, who played such a vital role in creating this whole amazing series of lectures. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Jones to deliver his lecture on archaeology and discovering the food of the past. Martin.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much, Master, and it's a real pleasure to be in a real lecture hall again. Like those of you joining us online, I've been incredibly grateful for the technology over the last few years, but I'm sure you'll understand it's rather nice to be in a room with all of you here. So, why do we look at the past? I guess if you're like me, if you're an archaeologist, you have a sort of unhealthy obsession with the past and you find more or less anything interesting. But if you're a more normal, well-balanced human being, there's still a number of reasons why you look at the past. We look at the past to get a sense of where we've come from and where we're headed. And sometimes we look at the past because we're yearning to get back somewhere. And it's that particular feature of the past that often recurs in the world of food. There's a number of us like to eat traditional food, and a number of us have an aspiration to get back beyond some modern period where everything went a bit wrong, and the idea that we could get back to some epoch in which food and eating was more harmonious, more natural, more close to our being. And that story, which recurs in how we think about food, occurs on various time scales. So we might want to just get back beyond a generation or so, back beyond fast food, takeaways, supermarkets, or we might want to get back a few centuries to get beyond industry, canning, processing, and all those things. And some of us want to get back, not centuries, but millennia, back past that key episode in the change of human foodways, the beginnings of farming, and to get back to a paleo-diet. And the paleo-diet now is currently behind an industry worth annually $10 billion, expected to grow in the next 5 years to $12.5 billion. So that's just one getting back diet, and that's quite big. So that's quite an interesting issue about getting back to the past. Well, I thought, I'm an archaeologist of food. I've spent my career doing archaeology of food. I try and use the methods of archaeological science to ask some questions about what we're trying to get back to. And I was conscious of a number of themes that we're trying to get back past. One theme, which comes up in the paleo-diet, is we've got a proper place in the food chain, and we've shifted into the wrong place. Either we're eating not enough meat or too many grains or something else, that the idea that we want to get back to a period in the past which was our rightful place in the food chain. The second idea is that food's moving around too much. There was a time when we had more home cooking, ate more locally, and that was a better way of doing things. And the third theme which recurs is that the food we're eating now is far too heavily processed, and we need to get back to a time when things were different. And I thought what I'd do is take a series of questions and look at archaeological methods and say, well, answer these questions. Where should we be in the food chain? When do we stop eating locally? And when did food processing emerge? So let's kick off with the first of those questions. Where should we be in the food chain? Now, I've been in archaeology for just over 50 years, and when I started out, that was seemed like a much easier question to answer. If we go into a museum, one can get a sense of it. Here on the left, you can see a museum display in which the finds from the pre-agricultural period, the Paleolithic period, are dominated by stone tools, a number of which, there's a good argument, they were for chopping up animals, and also the animal bones or antlers, a number of which have the cut marks on where they chop the meat off. And about 25 years before I started in archaeology, the wonderful caves of Lascaux were uncovered, and just one of many examples of scenes involving predatory humans and large animals. So when I started out, the archaeological record shouted the answer to, where we should be in the food chain. The answer is meat, meat, meat. It's got a lot to do with meat. Now, that answer isn't entirely wrong. It is the case that those cut marks on those bones, we still think they were taking meat off the bones and so forth. And we may have got some of the functions of the stone tools right and others wrong. Who knows? But one way or another, there's a lot of meat around. It's more that that picture was rather incomplete. And it's only in retrospect, looking back to how we dug half a century ago, I realized how much we relied on what we could see with the naked eye and either pick up and hold in our hands and touch. And during the course of my career, I've seen, on the one hand, at a very basic level, fine sieves come into play, then microscopes come into play, and then colleagues who understood the wonderful developments of recent chemistry come into play. And gradually, the range of things we've looked at has got smaller and smaller and smaller, and that just picked up a number of other things other than the meat. Now, my role in this was, I was very fortunate to come in at a time when sieving for plant remains was taking off. And the way it was taking off was archaeologists realized that if they were to study the origins of agriculture, they needed to be able to find plant remains, and they weren't finding them in the traditional way of excavating. And so a whole series of sieving techniques came on board, often combined with mixing in water. Very basic technology, but that process of just taking archaeological dirt, sticking it in a bin full of water, letting the charred plant remains float up, and then decanting through a sieve, just transformed the picture of what was in the archaeological record. And it's quite surprising that if you're digging in a conventional way, it's not just you're missing microscopic stuff. Even grains that are a few millimeters long would be missed. And that was something that was only realized when archaeologists started sieving and floating on a big scale. So from the late 60s, early 70s, there were a series of big projects looking at the origins of agriculture, particularly in Southwest Asia and Central America. And the view over those archaeological sites was just different. There were sieves and flotations shaking all over the place. And that was the world in which I started my archaeological work. And it was a very exciting world. I mean, one of the things that was coming up in those sieves were a whole series of very unusual crops and things that back in the 70s seemed to be heading quite quickly towards extinction. But now, thankfully, we can go into shops in the high street and buy spelt wheat, emmer wheat, millets, and in fact, sometimes they're actually sold under the banner of ancient grain. And that's been a nice turnaround. But back in the late 60s and early 70s, a large range of these plants were disappearing. So that was a very exciting time, and I had a very enjoyable research career of looking at those unusual cereals and looking at the weeds with those cereals to rebuild the different ways of agriculture. And about 20 years ago, I was conscious that by then it was very routine. If you were digging a farming site, you had sieves and flotation and found all this stuff. But the Paleolithic sites were dug in a different way, and actually for very good reason. Those older Paleolithic sites, the deposits are more precious and rarer, and there was a tendency to go at sections with quite a fine excavation methods rather than get large amounts of sediment into the dustbin full of water and lift off all the seeds. But I was quite keen to go to a site, a Paleolithic site, and treat it as if it was a farming site, and put a lot of dirt through a flotation machine. And I wasn't sure how possible this would be. And I was so pleased that one of the leading figures in Paleolithic archaeology, Eurasian, who you can see in the blue shirt there, was happy for me to do it on one of the most celebrated Paleolithic set of sites in Europe. And these are the sites in the Czech Republic, which are between 20 and 30,000 years old. And they are the sites, they've been excavated on and off over the last century, and they are the sites that feed those pictures of mammoth hunters that we remember from our school books. These are the classic mammoth hunting sites. And you can see in the middle of that picture, they're also the sites of some of the earliest portable artwork in Europe. And this around about 26,000-year-old model of a mammoth it's about this big, and it's carved from a piece of bone. So lovely sites. And I was and Yerzy was very happy that we tried this out. And on the left in that image, you can see a very classic way of working with one of these Paleolithic sites. Yerzy and his colleagues are looking through a section of windblown loess, and they're looking at about 15,000 years of accumulation there. And that windblown loess offers us the best on land, rather than under the sea, the best on-land record of climate change. So as they're looking at that section, they're seeing all the episodes of climate fluctuation over the last few thousand years. And a classic way that Eurasian would work is within those sections, you could actually see the human presence in fireplaces, a few bones, and so forth. And it was very trusting of Eurasian to allow our Cambridge Brunel team to do what you see on the right, which was much more like you dig a farming site. You actually shift a lot of earth and put it through flotation machines to see what was there. So, well, we did that. We floated a lot of dirt. And one of the things we found is this item on the left, which is just a few millimeters across. It's a burnt crumb. And on the right is from the same site, one of the most celebrated, a wonderful image of known as the Donna di Viestonici Venus, a beautiful piece of artwork in fashioned clay. And the reason I show it is that was the competition for my burnt crumb. Now, I realize you may be on one side or the other, but I want to share with you my personal aspiration for this lecture. If by the end of this lecture you are a bit of the way to accepting that my burnt crumb is as interesting as the Donna di Viestonici Venus, then I'll achieve something. I shall also be suggesting that conceptually they're not as far apart as you might think. But let's leave that till later. I wanted to show you the other find. This is another find in the grey image there. And that hasn't been ground up and baked and all that stuff. It's been burnt, but it hasn't been ground up. And so any of you who have ever, you don't have to be a botanist, any of you who have ever sliced through a carrot will recognize that this is an edible root. It's quite tiny. It's just a few millimeters across. And it's not in the carrot family. It's actually in the daisy family. And I've just put around images around the outside of a number of the daisy family plants that have edible roots, including chicory and salsify and burdock. Just to make daisy roots are edible. And in the ethnographic record, you can find communities who comb through the earth, collecting large numbers of very small roots as a form of food. Now, I've also put an image of a mammoth in there to remind us what else those folks are eating around 26,000 years ago. And the main message that I would convey from this image is the sheer range of the diet in the Paleolithic. I've thought about, there are many other species that move around between their food source. I've tried to think of another species that ranges between bringing down and eating some of the largest animals roaming the land surface through to combing through the turf for tiny roots. And I can't think of one. I'm sure afterwards someone will tell me about one. But I think that the range there in the human diet is impressive. Now, we collected a lot of daisy roots, and around them, in the same deposits, were a lot of large animal bones. And you know, the zoologists do their stuff, our team do their stuff. There's a lot of figures and so forth. But it's not possible from that evidence to talk about whether it was 50% this or 30% that. It's not possible to turn that into how much meat were they eating, how many plants they were eating, because the formation of the archaeological record is too complicated. And if we want to move from this qualitative picture to a quantitative one, we have to switch to an entirely different method, which is the one the head of department here, Tamsin O'Connell, has perfected over a number of years. And I'm just going to give a little cameo of it. It's to do with looking at stable isotopes. And there's a lot of work in this and a lot of elements involved. I'm just going to give you one example. You'll be familiar with one isotope of carbon, carbon-14, which is one of our best archaeological clocks because it breaks down in a systematic way. There's two others that are stable. They don't break down, and they enter the same chemical reactions, but one is just a bit heavier than the other. So if you've got a kind of chain pathway, something like a food web, the lighter one will just move through more easily than a heavy one. And if the elements of those food in that food web actually capture the carbon in their bones, then the proportion of the isotopes is a marker of where they are in the food chain. So lower down in the food chain, there'll be more of the heavy isotope than higher up. And that's proved a great quantitative measure of where we are in the food chain. And Michael Richards is in the same field as Tamsin, and I've just plotted here a series of Paleolithic human bones. And on the left, they're 33,000 years ago, so 3 times as old as agriculture, going through to about 11,000. So there's 20,000 years of Paleolithic life there in different human bones. Now, if going back to the Paleolithic, we had a place in the food chain, which was our place in the food chain, you'd expect all those dots to fall within one line. And what you can see there is they don't. They vary, and I suggest to you that variation is a significant variation. And just to give you some idea, those 2 red lines distinguish people who are just eating terrestrial protein from those where a quarter of what they ate is from the sea. So that's quite a distinction. So those are just dots on a graph. But if we think of that in terms of communities and geography, I just want to kind of highlight a couple of sites. One of those is Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge, and the other one is Kendrick's Cave near to Llandudno. And they're both the same age, they're about 12,000 years old, and they're about 200 miles from each other. Now, 200 miles may seem quite a way, but if you look at the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherers are quite mobile. And so, for example, there are 6 communities of hunter-gatherers in the ethnographic record who would make that journey within a single year. And so it's quite close, and they would have found people eating differently. So the main thing I want to convey here is, in the Paleolithic, not only were people eating differently, they were aware of neighboring communities that ate differently from them. My colleagues, Rob Foley and Marta Lahr, over several years have built up a thesis of the human species as one where cultural variability is very deep-seated, and it's very deep-seated in our species. And in many ways, I see this part of the lecture as just presenting a few foodie snapshots of what they're arguing for the whole species. So variety, it's not the same in different places. And just to kind of make that point in a different way, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite Paleolithic sites on the Sea of Galilee, where there's been an awful lot of sieving and floating. It was a beautiful site in that it was exposed in a dry summer when the Sea of Galilee shrunk back and exposed this pickled site from which there are snails, birds, fish, tortoises, deer, and so forth, and 90,000 plant remains that Udi Weiss, the archaeobotanist, found, of which 20,000 were the grasses that over 10,000 years later would be domesticated as cereals, and back then were beaten through the sward. So this very lively, complex ecosystem. And if one asks what's happening back where Dolní Věstonice was, they're still hunting mammoths there, still hunting large animals. It's switched a bit to reindeer. But if we look at Europe at the time of Ohallo, you've got coexisting foodways which are strikingly different. Now, Central Europe and the Sea of Galilee are further away from than those 2 sites, Llandudno and Cheddar Gorge. But even these distances are well within the lifetime mobility of several extant hunter-gatherer groups. So what you can see there is diversity. There isn't a singularity in the past. There's great variety and diversity. So that's the first question. Let's move to the second question about when did we stop eating locally. And we can start that question looking at the present, in which on any high street, one has a real sense of how food is global. If this is in Brixton, but if we travel around Cambridge today, we can make culinary journeys from Venezuela to Japan, all over the world. We can see that extraordinary diversity, and that's very much the world of modern dining and the restaurant that we heard about from Alex 2 weeks ago. And there's a rather wonderful thing you can do called Google Ngram, which I won't go into the details, but it gives you a sense of how words are floating around in different periods. And you can see that international flavor emerge in the epoch of the restaurant by this method of seeing the usage of words. So Google Ngram looks at, in the early 19th century, you can see in English language texts, France, Germany, and Italy all appearing, foie gras, ratatouille, croissant, lasagna, and hamburger. If one moves forward to the 1900s, we see Spain and the Mediterranean come online. And over the last 100 years, you see the rest of the world. And you can see there the whole world of the restaurant. And just to kind of pick up on the points Alex was making, that the restaurant culture was very much a culture in which you could go in any time you want, you could go in with who you want, and you could eat what you want from anywhere in the world, and you chose your dishes on a la carte, on the map. So you were in there in control of the world on the map. And a number of the dishes you chose had some location, real or imaginary, associated with the menu. So to some extent, we might start off by thinking this global nature of food is something of the restaurant age. If we move from there to ask the question, well, while restaurant diners were eating like this, what did people without money eat? What did ordinary peasants eat? And I've just picked out a few images of ordinary people in the 19th century. You can see on the left wheat in North America, and then some maize being pounded in Uganda, and then Holland, it could be Ireland or a number of other places, 19th century peasants eating potatoes. You've probably guessed that I've chosen these three images because the underlying culinary journeys are far greater than those in the restaurant. The wheat in North America originated in Southwest Asia. The maize that's being pounded in Uganda is a crop that has its roots in Central America. And the potatoes in Holland have their roots in South America. And so even though it was a different style, global food is, underpins what the poor were eating as well as the rich when they were entering restaurants. And that whole model of exchange is the thing that Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange. And you can see here a whole series of different global movements that followed Columbus' journey in 1492 and the possibility of sea transport. And the thing I want to emphasize about this map is there are some fancy goods moving. There are some non-essentials moving. You can see tea and cocoa, sugar is delicacy, but there's also, and tobacco, but there's also a lot of staples, a lot of ordinary foods that made that journey. I mean, potato, wheat, rice and so forth, manioc, cassava, that made that journey and quickly became embedded in local cuisine. So that globalization was a key point as soon as sea travel happened. That sort of information comes largely from history, and if we look at archaeology, then we can take it back further and see certain things moving around earlier on. And on the left here is a rather garish item. It's a gold and silver item that was recovered just about an hour's drive from Cambridge around 30 years ago in the Suffolk village of Hoxton. And if you turn it upside down, and you can see the underside in the center there, you can see it was a spice dispenser. And there's a range of options of what spices it could be, but at the same time as the Hoxton spice dispenser was laid down, a number of sites in the Roman Britain and elsewhere had things like peppercorns in, and peppercorns actually turn up in latrines and wells from a number of different sites in Roman Britain. And those peppercorns are not native to anywhere in Europe. They've come from the Malabar coast in southern India. So you can see back in the Roman period some quite long-distance movements from way beyond the Roman Empire. Another archaeobotanist, Alexander Livada, has pulled a lot of this information together for Northwest Europe rather than Britain. And what this image here shows, drawn from Alexander's work, a summary of exotic crops that had been found in Northwest Europe, in Roman deposits, in the Roman period. And you can see a whole range of things there. From quite close around the Mediterranean, you can see cumin and date palm. You can see melons coming from Southwest Asia. A whole range of things of sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum, meligita, sesame, bottle gourd. There's the peppercorns from the Malabar coast in India, alongside cardamom and cucumber. From Central Asia, peaches and apricots. From East Asia, rice. And from the Molucca Islands, nutmeg. And all of these things are turning up in Roman deposits. So you really see, for the old world, a global movement of plants during the Roman period. Now, up to about 15 years ago, we would have thought this is probably as far back as food globalization goes. And by about 15 years ago, there were terrific records for some parts of the world. There were terrific records of crops from the archaeological deposits in Europe. And so it was quite easy to tell stories about the spread of wheat and barley from the Near East across the coast of Europe and across the mainland of Europe. And you could do a lot of work on those Near Eastern crops. There were other crops that were turning up in such small quantities and of plants that hadn't been researched very closely that they hadn't received a lot of attention. And one of the crops that I got interested in is shown in the top left-hand corner of this slide. And this is a plant called broomcorn millet, which is known today in Europe as much as a form of bird seed, as a form of human seed. But it's a plant that's interesting because it's quite an important crop in China. Now, when we started out, it really wasn't a crop that anybody knew much about. So the appearance of millet seeds in Europe was seen as, well, maybe there's several points of domestication of this plant and so forth. And we decided to have a look at it. And also around this time, something else was happening in archaeology, and that was a new awareness of how much genetics had to tell archaeologists. Now, if I think back to how it worked, the first thing that got archaeologists' attention was the possibility of studying ancient DNA, which on the one hand was exciting, and we could go and see Jurassic Park, and it was clearly very relevant to archaeologists because it was getting DNA out of ancient material. And indeed, ancient DNA has had a major contribution to make to how archaeology has unfolded. But at the same time, and part of the similar momentum of massive advances in genetics and DNA chemistry, there was the emergence of a whole series of long genome sequences. This was a period in which a whole series of records of what was actually in the chromosomes was being encountered. And I think archaeologists were surprised. I mean, from a distance, I think the archaeological community, it's probably the biological community knew far more. The archaeological community assumed that genes were about doing useful biological work, that genes made protein, and protein made plants and animals live. And the archaeologists were pleasantly surprised at how much of DNA sequence didn't seem to be doing that. It seemed to be doing, we weren't quite sure, but it was accumulating mutations and forming an amazing historical monitor of historical change. So the non-coding DNA was like a gold mine for archaeologists. And today I would say the way it works is that archaeologists use contemporary DNA to get incredible historical stories of both humans and the plants and animals they eat, and use ancient DNA to anchor it in the timescale. And I had the privilege over that time to work with two great plant geneticists, Diane Lister and Harriet Hunt, who you can see in this picture. And I want to just explain what Harriet's doing, because it's quite important, the work we did. Now, Harriet, you can see, is in the Cambridge Botanic Garden glass houses with a series of flower pots. And each one of those flower pots corresponds to one of the circles in the bigger map. And in that, she's planted a land race. Now, all a land race is someone's collected it from a farmer on one of those dots and asked the farmer, where did you get your seed corn? And if the farmer said, you got the seed corn in the market, or whatever, that's not a land race. If they said, I got the seed corn from my brother, or from my own store, or from a neighbor, that is a land race. That's what we call a land race. And it's an empirical finding. It's not something intrinsic. That's all we know about land races. It's an empirical finding that those land races store an extraordinary historical record of how those crops have moved around, essentially because the geographical movement of those land races over time has not been great. So that's not something we know. It's something we infer from the patterns. And so each of those circles, the colors in the pie diagram, Harriet has extracted from one of the pot plants there. And by looking at the relatedness of those circles, Harriet's able to draw the ellipses and group the land races into different ones, all of which to track back to the same area in North China, which I've shown with a star. And that is where most of the millet agriculture in the world goes on today. So, in a nutshell, that genetic evidence demonstrates that the broomcorn millet arriving in prehistory in Europe had its origins in China. So this was really interesting and something we were interested to explore, which we did by engaging with colleagues in China and going to work with them. And the other thing that happened at the same time is I mentioned roughly when in Central America and Southwest Asia people started floating, and then others started floating in Europe. The timing was such that new form of archaeology was taking off in a big way in China. And there's a number of individuals, of which a key person is a great guy, Professor Zhao Jijun, who we call Jimmy, just in case I slip into calling him Jimmy. And at the same time as from the few millet grains we were getting in Europe, we built this picture of a spread across the world from China. Jimmy Zhao was applying flotation techniques all over China. And in the top, you can see a range of millet grains that actually were from North China. And rather than one or two grains in the occasional European sample, there he had masses and can tell lots of stories about how it got bigger through time and so forth. But the interesting thing was, in the same way that we'd found millet amongst the European samples rich in wheat and barley, he was getting wheat and barley remains in China. And you can see these barley, in the bottom right corner, these barley grains and barley rackuses and wheat grains and wheat rackuses are all from China. So it became clear that it was a two-way process. And Diane Lister, who I mentioned, did similar work to Harriet on looking at the genetic variation of wheat and barley and drew arrows in this way. So that was a really nice development. And what it's culminated in is this map of what food globalization looked like. Twice as old as the Roman spice trade and 7 times as old as the Columbian Exchange. So this form of food globalization went way back. Now, this great kind of spaghetti of arrows reflects a number of things. It's built by a combination of genetics and archaeobotany and some other stable isotope studies. And it's some of it's our team. It's not all our team. There's a number of teams in the world who've produced that data, but I'm very pleased to say that a significant number of those teams are led by one of our Cambridge graduates. So that's very nice. And I know some of them are watching online, so I want to mention that. So we've pushed it back, as I say, twice as old as the Roman spice trade and 7 times as old as the Columbian Exchange. What happens if we go back further still? And not surprisingly, if you go way back, movement does get less, but it doesn't just disappear. And when I show this arrow, this map of crop movement 7,000 years ago, 5,000 BC, you can see particularly the Western crops are moving around. But it's a bit more complicated to argue then whether it's the crops moving or the people moving with crops. And if you go back further in time, as we've seen in the Paleolithic, mobility is a key part of the process. So if you take the whole food chain of humans and their food plants, after 1500 BC, the food plants are moving around. At an earlier stage, the people are moving around. Sometimes both are moving around. There isn't really an episode that you can pin down when the human food chain is substantially localized. Mobility has been some theme somewhere other than the food chain for a very long time. So let's move to our third topic now of when did food processing emerge. And I just love this image of the wonderful Beamish Museum in Durham. And this shelf captures an important episode in the history of cuisine between the start of the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the refrigerator, which was probably the peak of food processing. And on these shelves, it's supposed to be a grocer's shelf from about 1910 or something like that. And on these shelves, you can see foods that have been ground up, colored, boiled, and fermented. And I don't know if you can make out the top left-hand corner, but I wondered whether to ask Darwin College catering manager Ivan Hickney to supply us with some beef and malt wine. But I'm sorry I chickened out. I'm sorry about that. But our image of processing then is something that we want to escape, and there's been a whole series of raw food movements, a number of them religious and monastic, and today, in the 20th century, a whole series of raw food diets have emerged. And the idea that that processing is bad is a recurrent one. So let's have a look then at archaeological attempts to find the beginnings of processing. And I'm going to start with the most complicated one, which is fermenting. Now, fermenting applies to a lot of foods. There's a lot of foods where the processing involves controlled rotting in one way or another. And the one that has endlessly fascinated archaeologists is alcohol. And you can see there a number of claims for the earliest agriculture. In the top left, you can see a series of 9,000-year-old ceramic jars from Jiahu in China, in which Pat McGovern, who you can see in the middle, has argued contained alcoholic beverage. Now, I'll just explain something about how his argument works. If you take alcohol itself, it's a very volatile substance. It's not something we expect to find trapped in the archaeological record. But it's also a very good solvent, and a number of alcoholic beverages dissolve something. And the one that I think is easiest to give as an example is Retsina. When we taste Retsina, we taste a pine resin that's dissolved in the alcohol. So if you put Retsina in one of these jars and left it 9,000 years, there isn't any chance the alcohol would still be there. But that pine resin, even in tiny quantities, can get trapped in the pores in the clay. And an important thing that's happened at the same time as all this has come on stream is that chemists have come up with methods of detecting minuscule quantities of material. And so you don't need that many molecules of pine resin component to pick it up there. And so McGovern's looked at the things like that were in the pot and has argued that that's 9,000-year-old wine. And being an enterprising guy, he's sold it and marketed it. You can see some Jiahu wine bottles around him. It's pipped at the post by this 13,000-year-old brewery from Rakovet in Israel, which you can see on the right, which again has these preparation surfaces, which by microscopic and chemical tests, Liliot and colleagues have argued was a kind of microbrewery. Now, because archaeological chemistry is moving at the pace it is, I think we're going to see some much more refined methods to look at fermentation in the past. And I was talking to my colleague Matthew Collins about this recently. And my conjecture is, for various reasons, I think fermentation is going to go way, way back beyond that. But that, I should stress, is conjecture, and I should really turn to hard evidence, and I'll turn to another form of processing and some very hard evidence, these pounding stones. And if you notice the time scale we're looking at, this is a cave, the Tabun cave in Israel, where the deposits are 1/3 of a million years old, and there are artifacts such as these pounding stones in there. And the pounding stones are interesting because although one thinks of stones as quite hard, the micro-wear on the surface can be produced by some surprisingly soft material. And you can see in the top left there some images of what you could see under the surface of these pebbles. And if you studied micro-wear, and it involves a lot of experimentation and grinding and so forth, then you can speculate on what caused that. And Ron Schimmelmintz did a lot of experimentation to persuasively argue that these pounding stones had been used to pound soft organic tissue, most likely for food preparation. And so there you've got mashing up of food components back a third of a million years ago. Well, there's another form of food processing that the evidence goes back even earlier, and it's the one that's kind of associated with being at the heart of food processing, and that's cooking. And here you've got the Vonderwerk cave in South Africa, and deposits that are 1 million years old, and you can see those deposits on the right-hand side of the slide. And within those deposits are fine lenses of ash, and you can see a lens of ash on the bottom right-hand corner, little fragments of burnt bone, and also fragments of burnt stem. And these are in a hearth built by humans, and it's 1 million years old. I should say that there's a lot of evidence of fire in things like lake sediments and sea sediments going back further than that, but it's generally, in many parts of the world, wildfires are part of the Quaternary. And the great advantage of going into these deep caves and finding something that is structurally a hearth is you can be more confident that these are human beings who've done this and created this. So before leaving processing, I want to say something about the raw foodists might ask, what is food processing for? Why do we need to do the processing? And it's quite interesting that, I mean, every other species apart from us is a raw foodist. So why do we do it? And why do we spend the effort on it? And the most persuasive argument around is something that Io and Wheeler articulated as the expensive tissue hypothesis. And in a nutshell, in order to evolve our big brains, an expensive tissue is part of our tissue that uses up a lot of calories, and a number of things like our gut and our kidneys and our brain use up a lot of calories. And the thesis is that the body can only afford a certain mass of these. And so as the gut, an expensive tissue, as the brain, an expensive tissue, gets larger, some other expensive tissue has to shrink. And organs like the liver are doing far too important work, but the one that can shrink is the gut. And indeed, looking at the physiology of our cells and our relatives, you can see that's what did shrink. And that's possible if you can assist digestion by processing outside the body. And so the general kind of model is what food processing is about, is it's allowing our brains to grow. And the anthropologist Richard Wrangham made a very interesting argument about this in terms of cooking and fire. But one interesting thing about brain is expansion. So far, we know controlled fire goes back 1 million years. Brain expansion begins about 4 million years ago, and it may well be that other forms of food processing, like pounding, are more important. And I just wonder, again, I stress, without any evidence, whether leaving food to rot and ferment has a much older lineage than one thinks. So I've gone through 3 different elements of diet that we want to get back beyond to some more harmonious, stable state. And I've kind of argued they're all a bit illusory, that if you go back into the human past, you don't find a singularity, you don't find some natural form. None of those things work. And so you could ask, well, are there any features of the human diet that characterize our species throughout that long period? Oh, actually, I want to actually talk about another thing before that, and that is another. I want to turn to the crumb, because as I mentioned, I wanted to get you interested in the crumbs, and the crumb I showed before was around 26,000 years old in Central Europe. This crumb and you remember I talked about early art and a number of other things that relate to early modern humans. We realize now that the place to look for those emergence of those early modern human characteristics is the Cape region of South Africa. And what you can see here is one of those Cape region sites, the site of Blombos, and ignore all those sandbags. They're just protecting the layers. If you look by the stools, you can see a series of archaeological sections running down by the stools. And one of my students, Cynthia Larbe, did some wonderful work on these sites, working with these sections to pull out fragments of early food. And these sites are like 3 times as old as Europe. They're like 80,000 years old. And you can see in the top right-hand corner one of Cynthia's burnt crumbs from an early human site. And below it, you can see some of her scanning electron microscope work in which she's established, and the rectangles within that show different plant taxa ground up and mixed together. In other words, it's a recipe. Things of flavors have been mixed together to produce something. So it's a hint at culinary art. And although it's just crumbs, I fantasized that the shape of the dough they produced, it wasn't just, that they shaped it how they wanted it. And so this is an example of culinary art that isn't so far conceptually from the more durable pieces of art that one can see. And in the case of Blombos, I put in the top left-hand corner this engraved piece of ochre, not very long, about that long. And so the food quest is a creative, artistic venture, just as it is now. And so returning to the point about what is the enduring feature of all this, and I would say the enduring feature of the human food quest is we are the species that can change our mind, and we can change our mind without any major physiological or genetic adjustment. That applies right across the board, but we are the species that can change our mind about what we eat and how we eat. And I would suggest, the evidence suggests we've always done that. There isn't some timeless ancient way of eating. And I would put a rider to that. It hasn't always been good news. In another lecture, we could talk about the history of ecological vandalism. And I think on a per capita basis, we ourselves might not even be in the top league. So it's not a story without its downside. We are the species that experiment creatively, sometimes disastrously, sometimes brilliantly. But that is what we do. That is our nature, that we can quickly change our mind. And that is how we work and what we've got to work with. And I just wanted to finish with 2 artifacts. And the one on the left is an impression of an artifact. They're actually essentially quite similar in that they both take carefully chosen fibers and interweave them with a due attention to mathematical precision. The one on the right is the acorn risk machine that has, in the last 30-odd years or something, has transformed the way we communicate, that our species communicates with each other through phones, computers, and so forth. The one on the left is the impression from Dolny Vestonitsi, the site that I've spoken about, of a technology that has transformed the way that we eat, both through 2 close cousins of technology, the net and the basket. And I have the sense that if Hermann Hauser had lived 26,000 years ago, he'd have been just as inspired and excited by the technology, possibility of the technology on the left, as the technology on the right. And so it's this image in comparison that for me capsulates what we find about human food waste. if we go back into the distant past. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for a really wonderful and fascinating journey back through time. I think you demonstrated how we can look at the past in order to understand our place, as you said, in the global food chain. Food globalization, I have no idea of the long history of that. And also the history of food processing. So it was wonderful, it really was. And I'm so glad you returned to tell us about breadcrumb. And you've certainly convinced me, and I'm sure the rest of the audience as well, how it's so much more important than any other artifacts that you were also showing. In fact, it's convinced me that you should indeed have been elected as a fellow of the Royal Academy, British Academy, sorry, in 1980. Had you been here to do so. But no, thank you very much. That was wonderful. It really was.